Sarah, your paper was excellent as coming out of those other two papers and sort of taking us some other places. I think contextually what was interesting to me is when you were sort of rattling off these things that we can go back and recover. Almost as an afterthought, I think maybe the second time you went through it, you mentioned debate. That, I think, is probably the most important. This is a debate tradition. And debate means a certain thing. It means I challenge you, you challenge me. That's what we should be doing. Right now, we're a little bit too friendly. We need to challenge each other because you nail somebody against the wall. This is jugular debate, too. You're going to kill somebody. And sometimes, literally, people died in these debates.
Really?
So what is that debate tradition? What is thinking in those terms? I'm not going to kill anybody today, but I think we need to think about that.
Yeah,
we need to
no,
recover
absolutely.
that sense of what Nagarjuna is doing. That's what scared people in India for 1,000 years. We can also recover the meaning of words. So for instance, we're contrasting Madhyamikans with Tarka. And we're using Tarka as an equivalent for something we're calling reason or logic. That's not what Tarka meant. Tarka meant a kind of logical speculation. If you look at the Nyaya literature, it's very clear. There's a difference between Pramana approach and a Tarka approach. And if you look in the Western tradition, the ancients and the medievals, they differentiated between demonstration or logic on the one hand and dialectic on the other hand. And Tarka, excuse me? Well, sophism is something else. You can be a speculator without being a sophist. You know, there are things, according to Aristotle, there are things you can know about, there are things you can't know about. Are planets closer than stars? That's a question of dialectic, maybe, or that's a question of demonstration. For him, that's demonstration. You can know that. Other things, is the world eternal or not? That's dialectic. So Tarka is something equivalent to that in the Indian tradition. So when they're castigating people as Tarkists, they're saying, you guys are just speculating, you don't really know what you're talking about. It sounds logical, but it's like counting the teeth of a crow and so on. They're not necessarily getting towards what we would call reason. I think we need to be careful about our terms, or we confuse ourselves. So
you mean when you say speculators, they're in some sense metaphysicians?
that's one kind.
Yeah, one kind.
That's one kind. So I think
I'd like to follow up on that and say I think that you're making a series of excellent points concerning the need for us to be a lot more careful about the semantic range of the terms that are found in the text that we're looking at. So this is a great example. My understanding of Tarka, just as one of the many terms that we would be needing to look at and make more careful study of, is that it again is a shifting term, as really all terms are. But and so then you have to have the added question of not only what is the semantic range of Tarka, but which aspects of that range is a thinker like Chandrakirti picking up on when he uses it. It's clearly a derogatory term for him. It's not always a derogatory term. You know, and Bhav Viveka has a Tarka Dwala, where Tarka there is used in a positive sense, and it's perhaps likely, or it's a question in any case, whether that is the reason for Chandrakirti to pick up on this term in this particular case. So you know, there are debate manuals and there are sources in the Sanskrit tradition that are not just Buddhist sources that we need to look at. And there are literary depictions of debates, and we need to look at those to see which words are being used. And my sense of this is that we're vastly in the infancy of these projects. So I would very much agree with you. I think it's an excellent point that any of the terms, really, pramana too, which feels more stable to us. We have to be aware that we've become very comfortable with certain kinds of terms and ways of talking about things, and I think we need to question that by going back and looking at other contexts. Yes?
But I seem to remember dimly that verses 105 and 106 of chapter 5 in the Tarkajwala discuss precisely this point, what the scope and significance of Tarka actually is. And the context there is an accusation from a Yogacara opponent who says, your view of the ultimate, oh Mr. Madhyamaka, Mr. Bhaviveka, is ridiculous because the ultimate is atarka gochara. That's the crucial technical term here. It's not an object or within the sphere of accessibility of tarka. And Bhavaveka comes back, you'll be happy to know, Jay, and he quotes you, actually. If he were here, he would say, bravo, sadhu, sadhu, Jay, well done, you have said it exactly. Let me see if I can quote your words back to you. It's the only way to understand that reason has limits is to use reason. For this reason, I say reason above all else. Now that you will find that actually, I think it's verses 105 and 106 in the 5th chapter of the Tarkachwala. So he says there basically that yeah, the Yogacara is right that Paramartha is not Tarka Gochara. It is not an object of reason. Of course it can't be. That's a scriptural principle. Sandy mentioned the Lankavatara Sutra, that's the locus classicus for a scriptural source in the Mahayana, but this is, it also is a Pali term, atak avachara, it's the way it's said in Pali. So it's an ancient concept, goes way, way back. But then he says, the only way you can understand what this means is to use reason. And for that reason, reason is pradhana. You said, above all else, he uses the word pradhana. That's his translation of your English phrase, above all else. And the intriguing thing about that, if I may speak just one more moment here, I'm so sorry to take the podium when I spoke so long yesterday, my apologies. But this word pradhana is important in a pramanic context. It means which pramana comes number one. It means number one, which is number one. So it appears twice in his work. One is in relation to the Mimamsakas who say that Agama comes number one. He says, no. The only way you can understand what Agama means is if you use reason to figure out which Agama is right. Otherwise everybody's got an Agama. You've got to use Yukti to figure out which one is right. And specifically in relation to these Yogacharas, the cool thing, if I may say so, is that he's saying not Pratyaksha, but Anumana. It is Anumana that is Pramana for him. So, Jay, thank you so much for quoting Bhavaviveka in this really important context.
For Bhavaviveka, the use of reasoning is probative.
Is what?
Probative. Probative?
Probative.
Yeah. Or do you think he uses reasoning as a kind of...
It depends what you mean by probative. Does it prove an object? No. Because there's no object to prove. But does it prove that your understanding of no object is the correct understanding of no object? Yes. It is probative in that sense. In the same way that Nagarjuna was using that word in, what was it, 23, Vigaravartani, or is it 22, where he said, Pratishede vartate, it carries out the act of pratisheda.
23, right now?
Is it 22 or 23? It was in my notes from yesterday. So it's probative in that sense. It says, oh God, I'd have to go back and look at it. But does he use the word prasadate? It proves a pratisheda conventionally, and in that sense it's probative. I think, George, I'll look. I'm sorry if I'm misquoting it.
Yeah, because I find Sandy's point hard to get my head around, because when I read Nagarjuna I find hundreds of arguments, and to say that this is some kind of literary device is like, what are you talking about? I have no idea. I have literally no idea. It's just like, are we in the same world? Are we looking? So, to me, the real interest is not whether he used reason or not, but how does he use it? And that's why I'm trying to, because that seems to me the real issue, that he used reason, and reasoning seemed to be just open the book. I have no idea what sense to make of a text rather than read the text, and when I read the text, I find hundreds of reasoning. And to say this a kind of literary device is like, no, this is not Derrida, sorry. This is Nagarjuna. So they are reasoning, and to me the really important question is, what's the status of this reason? That's why I'm trying to see whether, and the argument obviously, I mean, one of the important points is whether reason is probative or whether reason is just kind of would you say self-stultifying or self-deconstructive or
I don't think those are mutually exclusive.
okay.
Yeah. I just broke maybe.
This seems to be the issue that is important to explore. What's the use of reason and what are the commitments that the use of reason entails on the part of the person who used the reason?
I'm really thankful for the Bhava Viveka quote. I've got to go back.
Love it.
Yeah,
You
I
will
mean,
love it.
I think Bhava Viveka and Chandrakirti agree about a hell of a lot more than anybody lets on.
Well, fortunately, Bhava Veka wasn't alive when Chandrakirti was, so we have no way of testing
Right,
that.
right. Yeah. Anyway, all I would say to that is that the dichotomy or the dualism between reason being self-deconstructing and being probative is kind of illusory, right? Because if the self-deconstruction is going to be successful, it can only be successful because the reasoning is good, right? You don't succeed in a deconstructive enterprise, whether it's aimed at Sandy or aimed at me or aimed at yourself, with dumb reasons and dumb arguments.
Well, sometimes you could.
Well, no, you could offer dumb arguments, but you wouldn't thereby succeed.
You might, depends what your goal is.
And who you're talking to. Well, I mean, my goal is, I think the goal that I would take seriously would be a goal of giving good reasons for undermining reason. Not causal, right? I mean, I'm not like Sandy. I don't think that basically when you reason with somebody, it's just an alternative to slapping them. I think that you're trying to do something cognitive. So that if you're trying to demonstrate, I mean, again, I'll come back to my favorite examples in the West always, and that's Sextus or Hume, right? The arguments are disturbing because they're really good arguments against the fact that arguments themselves are ultimately convincing. And the reason that the arguments are disturbing is because they're really convincing arguments.
Yeah.
And that's why I say we're back to limit paradoxes. We're back to limit paradoxes. We're at the limit of argument. We get arguments which have to be taken as sound arguments for their own unsoundness. And that's why you get this paradoxical feel with Nagarjuna. And the paradoxical feel is for real, it's important, it's deep, but it doesn't undermine the fact that the arguments themselves are deeply compelling. That's, I guess, what I think about that one. And what I find, and to come back to the point about transformation, this is again a place where Sandy and I agree. If the point of these texts isn't to transform, then what's the point, right? There's a wonderful line in Leksha Nyingpo where Jai Rinpoche, after going through this wonderfully complex and convoluted argument about meaning, says, of course, the point of all of these arguments is liberation from cyclic existence. Otherwise, philosophy would be just for fun. And I don't think Nagarjuna is doing philosophy just for fun, even if I am.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, just real quick, because there were a number of things, yours and that you said, Jay. The point, now I forget exactly how you expressed it, but the point of the argument is for the argument to deconstruct itself, something like that, you said. So maybe this is about when does that point happen? At what point does an argument do that? And I mean, and does the status of the argument change at that point, or is the argument itself, or how we understand the argument, it changes at that point? I mean, in some sense, an argument that is designed to how'd you put it? Self-deconstruct? Is that what you said? An argument that's designed to self-deconstruct. I mean, what is this? I mean, how do we understand such an argument? In what context? I mean, what I'm trying to get at, George, and this probably won't help, but I'll go ahead and say it. when I look at arguments as fictional arguments, when I use the example of an argument in a novel, the argument of Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, I'm trying to say it's a way of trying to get at this peculiar, you said paradoxical just now, Jay, status of arguments that are designed to undermine themselves, and so I'm suggesting is here perhaps that's a way of understanding how these arguments function by looking at arguments in fiction.
No, but here's why I think that won't work, okay? And I'm sorry about this, Mario. I'm going to take it all back, okay? Mario and I were just in a discussion of fictionalism at Columbia a couple of weeks ago, and I was in my rabid fictionalist mode then, but I'm going to take it all back, at least here. The reason that, notice that what Sextus can do is to say, I'm going to give you now an absolutely sound argument against the position that you should ever be completely convinced by a deductive argument. And it works because it's a real argument and because it's actually really good. But if I offer you the following argument, I say, don't believe what I'm saying because I'm not actually saying it, it's all fictional. You shouldn't be convinced by that, Sandy. And the reason you shouldn't be convinced is because the premise is just plain false. It's not fictional, I'm actually saying it. And here are words to live by. Don't be convinced by arguments with false premises.
Okay, now I have to respond. That is not the way argument works in good fiction. No one says, Atticus Finch, I keep using example, but that's what I've got. He doesn't say I'm a fictional character. He gives real arguments, good arguments that draw the reader in. And in some sense, make
to the extent that they're good arguments, they export from the fiction.
Well, and where do they export to? They export into the reader's experience in some sense.
So, and I think I completely agree with George that it's manifest that there are arguments in the Madhyamaka, and I've learned so much from Jay. I think I agree with Jay here, but Jay, you obscure things by invoking this label of good argument, because I think a lot of people in this room, when they hear you use this word good argument, take you to mean something that has strong normative force embedded in the argument, right? The way Kant might have thought about arguments. But of course your examples, Sextus and Hume, are not committed to arguments being good in the strong normative force sense. They're committed to arguments being good in some other sense. Well, you look at the Hume and what you find is principles of association that move you along. And those start to look a lot more causal, although not causal in the same way that giving a pill or slapping someone might be causal. Or you look at the Sextus, where Sextus notoriously says, what you've got to do is calibrate the remedy to the ills of the patient. And that suggests that what good means for Sextus and Hume is that for people like us, good is going to amount to being in the idiom of reason. And to that extent, I can sign on to your thesis, Jay, that you have to accept that these are arguments. You couldn't do it any other way for us than to give us arguments, right? That's the right remedy for us as patients. But it might well be, and this is the extent to which I find Sandy's thesis compelling, it might well be that for other patients, other things would work. And then you lean heavily on the idea of working, right? What moves you as a practice? What moves you as a remedy in Sextus's sense? So I hate to try to steer between you guys and find some middle ground, but I think I'm finding a middle ground, and I think you obscure it, Jay, by using this word good without telling us what you mean by good.